yesterday finalized and this lecture series we are running every 8 months. Yeah.
He's also in the queue.
Yeah.
Happy to do whatever you want. And you are good studying.
Yeah. Obedience. Yes. Can we start?
Yes.
Very good afternoon to all of you once again. I welcome Professor Dr. Suresh Pandian from IIT Dhanbad. He is a well-acclaimed, well-known researcher and faculty of Environmental Science Wing of the IIT Dhanbad. Already we are associated with the IIT Dhanbad as a partner institute of repute, a partner organization in taking up the air quality monitoring and study. With this, I request our board analyst to introduce our today's guest speaker. So we are very happy to have you here as a guest speaker. We are eager to listen to you, sir. With these words, I request Mr. Arun Kumar, our board analyst, to introduce our guest to all our viewers. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all. Today we have a great personality with us, Dr. Suresh Pandian. He is serving as an associate professor in Department of Environmental Science and Engineering at IIT ISM Dhanbad, Jharkhand. His major area of research are heterogeneous traffic emission and dispersion modeling, rainwater analysis for air pollutant reaction, PM exposure dose, urban heat island effect, and emission inventory. At present, he is also a nodal officer at National Clean Air Program NCAP for the Jharkhand state. He is also affiliated with the Royal Meteorological Society, American Chemical Society, and Indian Institute of Chemical Engineering. Thank you, sir.
Sir, now I request our chairman, sir, to say a few words on this occasion. Sir, over to you.
Yeah, I will limit to welcoming you, sir, because I want to listen more from you rather than speaking myself. So it is wonderful to be with you. And let us start your lecture. Please, you can, I hand over to you for your delivery of your lecture.
Thank you very much, sir. It is my very sincere thanks for the invitation sent first. So it is also a privilege for me to address the eminent people and to deliver a lecture on behalf of this lecture organized by BSPCB.
Dr. Pandian, just for it, I'm interrupting 1 minute.
Yes, sir.
We also have participants in today's meeting from Terry and Patna Municipal Corporation. So
okay, sir.
It will be, a wide spectrum of people listening your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm sharing my material now. So I think I need to have a permission.
It's enabled.
Okay. Yeah, now I got it. So the topic of my presentation is going to be quantification of air pollution from transport sector and vehicular emission control strategies and implementation policies. So the list of contents I'm going to address under various subheading topics. So at beginning, I'm going to talk about the overall sectoral contribution of transport sector to the GHG emissions as well as to the air pollutions. Then I'm going to show some of the example calculations, how GHG is being done for transportation sectors. Then there are cross-sectoral analysis between the types of transport mode. Then there are policies at national level is implemented to talk about emission reduction strategies. So then I'm showing some of the results related to that of importance of this transportation emission to the overall ambient air quality with respect to the particulate matter. I mean, there are some results of the source apportionment that shows the difference between the local and rural and urban areas. So how these traffic emissions influence their local air qualities. So there are also about the emission modeling methods. So I take up some case studies to show about how emission is basically quantified from research and data compilation point of view, because these emissions forms the key input to the dispersion models, in where we are going to see the effectiveness of reduction in the emissions at the source level, how much benefit we are likely to incur. So these are all the overall lecture design for today's presentation. So as I said at the beginning, I'm going to talk about in very general and to show the importance of transportation sector among all other sectors that contributes for carbon emission as well as for the air pollutant emissions. So this is the diagram that shows emissions in gigatons of carbon dioxide. So the giga in the sense 10 to the power 9, and then the other figure that shows about exajoules energy use per year. So one can clearly see that 20 gigatons as a reference values in terms of carbon emissions, somewhat in between the year 2005 and 2010. So I mean, transportation sector clearly the top 3 contributing sources globally. So I mean, the top one or the highest contributing sector is without a doubt, it is the energy producing sectors, and then the transport comes either second or third. So this clearly tells us how important to understand about the contribution of transportation sector. So this is a simple equation. So we call it as either IPAT equation or famously known as Kaya identity equation. So where we saw in the last figure about the gradual, because the trend line clearly shows that the increasing, there is a growth factor. Mathematically, we come up with the rate at which the emissions are growing annually. So one can come up and do the mathematical analysis and models and try to understand, like last 30 years, 40 years or 20 years in each decades. So what was the growth rate? So if you talk about it, then the starting point to get the emissions. So how do the scientists come up with these kind of figures? And what is likely to be the emissions, let's say by the year 2050 or by the year 2100. So I mean, the famously a Japanese scientist known as Kaya, there are other equations which talks about IPAT. So P means population, A means appliance, T means technology. So in Kaya identity equations, you can see the very first term is population. So because the population increases, definitely anything associated with the consumption by the person will also increase progressively. And second factor that determines in what directions this emission will move in future years. So that is all about the economy, because if you are living in America, or if you are living in Germany or European countries, or if you are living in poor countries like, let's say, some of the African countries or other countries, then in that case, according to the place where you live and economy, that determines so your living style, and then the emission is associated with the economy, that is GDP. And then based on the GDP figures, annual or decadal, then there is factors and associated given to that of energy intensity. If you are able to achieve the economy at same level like developed countries, then similarly that also tells you that you have spent that much amount of energy, which is correspondence to that of carbon emissions, because energy spent is simply transformed into that of the emissions, because there are always it associated with the fuel combustion. So not only about the carbon emission, all of us knows that irrespective of the percentage of carbon content in any fuel, whether it is simple cheap solid fuel like coal, or you talk about the crude oil or diesels, or advanced level fuel like the natural gases or hydrogen or whatever it is, cleaner fuels, no matter whatever the type of fuel it is. So if there is a combustion, if there is a consumption, then it is eventually emits carbon dioxides, and as well as there are other pollutants which bothers us, especially with respect to the environmental engineers, and it bothers all of us, not only the person who is consuming and emitting it, it bothers every one of us. So therefore there is a lot of focus around it. So these figures I do not want to spend much time. It talks about per capita emissions and compares. One can clearly see that the figure of India. So the per capita emission means the total emission divided by the population, that is the per capita emissions. So because how do we, this is the one of the normalization factor, whom to blame. If we look into the countries, the population wise, we may be the second largest country, but still, so the total emission figure might look the top 5 or top 6, but then if you see with respect to our economy and the total population, that figures pale in comparisons with the developed countries. So that's why in COP, Convention of Parties meetings, most of the times, so who has to come forward to go for the emission reductions, right? So that burden basically will be moved towards the countries who are having higher per capita emissions. But still, China and India, so voluntary, I mean, they are not forced, but still, no, they come forward. India is one of the country. Our Prime Minister given commitment, like by the year 2030, what will be our emissions. Similarly, our Prime Minister made a commitment that, like we will be able to achieve some of the per capita emission reductions. So why we are talking all about is that, because if you want to talk about have a sustainable planet for all of us, then we must first stabilize the emissions and have a constant flat line, horizontal line. Then we will have to move in the direction of the declined emissions with the passing years. So whatever the trend line you have seen in the initial figures, it clearly shows actually it is having a growth factor. So we will be able to achieve only when we talk about minimizing the growth factor first, and then the constant emission, then gradually we will move towards the decline in emissions. Then where to focus? So that's why the initial figures helps you to understand. So where will I focus to achieve my target and commitment? So if you come up with the pie chart that clearly shows you what are the major contributing sectors, and easily the transportation is one among them. So the any mitigation measures to move in a directions, you can see clearly that transportation sector we need to achieve and decentralize the dependence upon the carbon fuel used in our transportation systems and automobiles. Only then we will be able to significantly move in the direction of achieving the desired set goal. So now let us talk about within the transportation systems, so the distribution. So in that case, so it's, you can understand that road transport, then rail transport, then aviation or shipment, the water transport. So there are several categories. Then again in the road transport, we can talk about the passengers, then we can talk about the freights. So there are different subsections. So now the road transport is a major contributing factor among the transportation sector without a doubt. So it has got certain merits, therefore that sector has grown very significantly compared to that of the other types of transportation.
इंडियन साइंस कांग्रेस में कलाम साहब का प्रेजेंटेशन स्विच कर दिया. Never know technology when it is. अपराध भी हो गया.
Now we learn how to tackle the situation due to corona.
Yeah.
So people are now expert in tackling such things.
But the corona has made us expert.
Yeah.
At least.
Yeah. I don't know whether he is aware that we are not able to play.
पहले में रखा हुआ सुनेंगे. Serious issue.
Yeah, we unmuted. Everybody can play.
We are not able to hear you. And now you are there. Yeah.
Sorry for the interruptions. So actually our institute internet policy demands for the user authentication details. So we do not know at what rate it demands me, but the same happened in yesterday's also. At the end of the meeting, not at this juncture at the beginning. I'm extremely sorry. Sorry for this interruption.
Please go ahead.
So these are some of the statistics that gives information related to the global figures. So there are many more slides. So what I do is that I quickly move on to the other important slides. So you can clearly see what are the major contributions when it comes down to the contributions by the transport sectors in India. One can clearly see that there are types of emission. We talk about complete combustion products, and then there are other types of emissions which are basically known as complete combustion products and then incomplete combustion products. So whereas the oxides of nitrogen and particulate matter pose major threat when it comes down to the degraded local level air qualities. So now let us see about these are the other materials which I took it from the recent report from our ministry talking about decarbonization policies, where we have a lot of scope to talk about achieving the carbon emission reductions. These are all the statistical figures that shows the weightage about the road transport sector's contributions. So one can clearly see the trillion passenger kilometer activity data in the last 20 years, and then the relative share among the types of vehicle modes. So easily two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and then the cars, buses, so have the major share as on today, whereas the growth in aviation and other sectors are minimal. The rail sector also seen a significant growth. So this is like the other figure, statistical figure. So how come one can come up with the total number of registered vehicles in India? Say for example, if you talk about the passenger cars and two-wheelers and the personal vehicles owned by any person in India. So this is the figure talking about the vehicle ownership per 1,000 inhabitants. I mean, it's very clear that we are not coming under the category of developed countries. So our figure is just above 100 when it comes down to the two-wheelers. But if you talk about the car ownership, then the figure is, very, very poor. It's still well below 50. Now this is, like I said, one is about the passenger kilometer, the other one is about the freight transport activities. Here also you can see the figures are given in terms of the trillion kilometers. So now you can see this is the energy consumption. So these are all the part of the country level emission inventory parts, because the classical data that tells you the total kilometer traveled, similarly the freights transported, similarly you see the fuel, the energy consumption in terms of the fuel consumed by the automobiles, right, in exajoules. So when you have these figures, it's easy for the engineers to come up with the determination of the emissions based on the figures. So now this is the simple, million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is this not includes the life cycle assessment completely, but this figure gives you the rough idea about the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions with respect to the individual travel modes. So now there is also other types of transport. So these are all the statistics. So I am going to talk about only the highlighting parts, right? So this talks about significant contribution by the non-motorized transport, but the report was from 2007 referring to that. So at that point of the time, it was the greater share in Indian scenarios compared to that of the similar cities in other part of the world. So if you do that statistics, then the significant share still the non-motorized transport is part of our country. And then what is the additional advantage of looking into that of this figure? It is all about we divide the categories, the active transport and passive transport. So any transport that consumes the fuel, we call it as a passive transport, and non-motorized transport basically is emission free. So that means, so in an overall figure, it could be part of your policy and for mitigation, where you can talk about promoting this active transport, right? So where one can promote the active transport, especially the I mean, you will have to then do the very high level analysis, right? Then talk about why person is owning a vehicle, and then for what reason is, I mean, that kilometer traveled by person. So for what purposes he is using his motorized transport. If you do that analysis, then you will be coming to know that majority of the time, either it is emission associated for him, he has to perform a trip from his home to the, I mean, origin to the destination, we call it as in transport model, and then home to the office and back to the home. Similarly, the kids will be performing the same from home to the school and back to the home and for their activities. Of course, the commercial activities like, I mean, the truckers or the commercial activities, the freight transport are altogether different. Over there, this doesn't come into future, but still it has a significant weightage in transportation study, simply because the freight transport is not the major contributor when we talk about in cities in intra level. I mean, if you talk about affected air quality within the city premises, then the emissions is majoritarily contributed by the passenger trips rather than the freight trips, because we have a separate time period allocated for heavy duty vehicles or freight transport, not to affect our traffic congestions. Therefore, during a daytime, easily I can say that the passenger trips is the significant contributor, which is also likely to have adverse health impact upon the populations living nearby the roadsides. So therefore, if we come up with the policies to promote the active transport, especially, then in that case, the majority of the share is allocated to the passenger trips. So therefore, this part is also one of the significant contributors when it comes down to the policies. So I'm not reading individual statistics given over here. So I have also took a lot of material from the same report that talking about the management systems in India and urban transport, how it is managed at national level. So there are three ministries: housing and urban affairs, railways and the road transport, and highways. Then we can also see about, I mean, what are the successful policies that are framed, like national urban transport policies, then the metropolitan transport authorities. So I mean, most of the times these policies talks about promoting the mass public transport. So like metro rails, I mean, where the congestion levels exponentially increases. Because why congestion is increasing? The simple question, and every one of us knows the answer. The newly added vehicle in each year is exponentially increasing, whereas however the road infrastructure, the length of the kilometers and width of the road, number of lanes, so those infrastructure do not grow at the same figure that of the number of vehicles added in each year, right? Therefore, we need to have policies that in line with urban development, urban growth factors. So if it is not clubbed, then it is very difficult to achieve the desired emission targets. So therefore, the ministries working together to achieve the desired emission targets. So it is like the similar in line with the policies. So majority of the time we talk about how to promote the public transport. Why? Because like you saw in the earlier slides, the CO2 equivalent emissions by the metro rail and by other methods, the buses, because we share the emissions, number of people using the metro in one trip. Similarly, the number of passengers carried away by the buses, right? So you could have seen in big cities, like there are double-decker buses, I mean, vertical as well as the lateral, right? So the number of passengers, simply the carbon emission or the pollutant emissions is simply divided, and it also helps you to mitigate the traffic congestion. If traffic congestion improves, in other words, it decreases the delay incurred for completing the same trip. So if you are spending, in some statistics clearly says that, in New York or other cities, or maybe even in Delhi or other big cities, a person wastes close to 40 to 60 minutes, sometimes even more than that, only in the traffic congestions, right? So that amount time spent is also related to the additional wastage of the fuel by your vehicles. then again one can multiply and find out the emissions accordingly. Now again another mitigation or policies to promote, especially the hybrid and e-vehicles, right? So we all know that in early 2000s, so diesel run autos and taxis are asked to change their fuels, say for example to the CNG or else LPG. Why? Because the mileage definitely improved compared to that of the diesel fuel, which has the greater possibility of adulteration also, and then the greater particulate matter and other emissions, which deteriorated the local level air quality. And if you want to talk about improving the air qualities, whenever you perform the air quality measurements, then majority of the time these are carried out at the major intersections. Why? Because it's where the number of vehicles and the congestions occurs is that particular locations. So that's why. And even there was a famous in Delhi they also tried to implement odd even concept. So that simply reduces the 50% of the total vehicles, passenger related vehicles that are used on the roads. But later on the practice was discontinued because so when they compared the results with the previous years, so they found that the reduction was not as expected. Why? Because if you do the emission inventory, it tells you the 50% emission reduction in terms of the mass of the pollutant emitted only from the passenger transport. But then it did not yielded in the similar percentage reduction in terms of the ambient pollutant measured. So of course that's altogether a complex topic for another day. So another one, like here you can see, like in Goa and all, one can clearly see the bike sharing practices. Now there is also in IIT Madras and in other IIT campuses. So they have come up with the concept of among the students also to promote the active transport. They have a hub and centers. Anybody can take up a cycle that are parked at major centers, hubs, and then you reach your destination, you drop your vehicle over there simply. Now, because if you do not have an infrastructure to support active transport, obviously then people will not get into habit. So, there are some ministers who also went to their offices by bicycles or by other cleaner transport methods just to increase the awareness among the people. So there is another greater research going on how this penetration, how to increase the penetration of e-vehicles. So there is a sharp increase in the numbers and percentage share because the reference year to the previous years, the numbers were too low. So basically the sectors, increase in the e-vehicles is happening at very higher rate. We need to have a policy that would support, that would encourage the public to invest the money and to procure the e-vehicles. Only then the project would give the desired results. Now I'm not getting into the travel, origin and destination and demand kind of other policies. So now another way to mitigate, of course, the initial policies all talked about, redistributing the vehicle population and mode percentage in such a direction towards achieving the lesser emissions. But of course, this is the enforcement, right? So we'll have to, still if it is, because still it is not avoidable, right? If it is not avoidable to use the motorized transport, then in that case, then there are emission standards, which we basically call as BS Bharat stage, the emission standards that are on par with Euro 6 emission standards, recently implemented. Now in olden days, the BS 1, 2, 3, 4, the implementation differed from place to place. Metro cities in first, then the fuel policy standards later on, then it would come to the tier 2 cities, then finally they will catch it up with the entire population including rural. Now we skipped the BS 5 from BS 4, and then there is a with NCAP mission as well as if you want to achieve it. So overall collectively it is very much in hour of the need that the vehicles, there is also a Supreme Court order came around in year 2008, if I'm not wrong, around about March 31st, that no vehicle can be sold after a particular cutoff date, right, of lesser than the BS 4 emission standards meeting. So and then I mean, there are several initiatives and measures from government side. So to increase the awareness among the public as well as to promote the policies that would yield benefit to the overall community. Now I'm moving to the second part of my lectures. Okay, so now why we need to talk about the transportation sectors? Why? Because so we have a clear indication from the transportation sector. So the no vehicles, I mean the fuel, it runs because it consumes the fuel. Okay, it's fine. Okay, it's giving carbon dioxide and it's giving incomplete combustion product, carbon monoxide, unburnt fuel, hydrocarbons, which is also led for the Los Angeles smog very famously. The London smog, let's say, because of the sulfur present in the coal, whereas the Los Angeles smog clearly put emphasis upon having the emission standards for the vehicles. That was the starting point actually. So now where do we stand in terms of ambient air quality? In ambient air quality, we do not talk about, the list is having close to 12 pollutants, but our concern is always PM10 and 2.5. Now it's very clear from the earlier discussions that the vehicle is consuming the fuel. It may not be the coal. Of course, the vehicles consumed coal, not now, many years ago or many decades ago. Now, okay, the fuel transform and meeting the set the standards, let's say, but still the increase in number is not giving the desired results. Let's say all the vehicles, because our traffic fleet, you take example of any city, is definitely not going to have the vehicles meeting the BS6 emission standards. Why? Because there it will be a mix. It will be mixed. Our traffic fleet will have BS6, BS4, BS3, BS2. Sometimes, I mean, older vehicles has to phased out eventually. Now, major concern for which pollutant, the non-attainment comes into picture because of this PM10 and 2.5. Now let's talk about how this transport sector contributes to it. So in these slides, I have shown the directly emitted particles and then their chemical composition, and then versus the precursors that are means not directly emitted. Secondary means it is actually converted by the other processes and chemical reactions. They are emitted in the form of gaseous pollutants, but however they are converted into the particles or ions. We call it as aerosols in short form. So now this is one of the US EPA report. This figure shows the relative contribution in urban versus rural in areas. So if you see, only ammonia is contributed by the rural areas compared to that of the urban areas, right? So let us talk about what are the reasons for this. So how come one can understand why the air quality is severely affected in urban areas, right? If you ask that fundamental questions, then you will come to know that in one way the transportation also contributes in one way, right? So how come one can understand by performing a study, right? The sulfate, the relative ratio between the contribution of the sulfate, measured sulfate, right? There is not much differences, right? But whereas if you talk about carbon and the nitrogens, these are NOx, right? Collectively, right? Nitrates, they are at many folds higher than that of the relatively rural and background areas. So only ammonia was found to be contributed more in rural areas. I mean, reason is given, like it's with the agricultural reason is given as agriculture in rural areas. This is another research report which talks about basically the differences. It also clearly shows, if you see the fourth column where traffic, the measured PM and relative contribution by the major sectors, right? Total share. If the measured PM is, let's say, 18.6 microgram per cubic meter, the traffic contributed only 4 microgram per cubic meter. In bracket percentage shows 22%. That is for the background and rural area. And if you talk about in urban and the relative difference when it comes down to the sources categories differences, now it's very clear in the last row, right? In urban area, 54% contribution by the traffic. If you consider only the local sources among the local sources, right, then the number shoots up to the 93%. So if you want to manage air quality in urban areas like city like Patna or the million plus cities or any major metro cities, then it's very clear that you will have to work hard to decrease the traffic congestion, as well as to increase the infrastructures to promote active transport, and then to promote the vehicles that will be in e-vehicles or using fuels other than the diesel or gasoline. I mean, the same is explained in terms of statements, so I am skipping them. So now among the emissions, so now I mean, even in India, IITM Pune, ARAI, they all performed detailed emission inventory and source apportionment. So predominantly there is also differences when it comes down to the PM10. The major contributor is not the tailpipe emissions. The major contributors are non-exhaust emissions, right? Fugitive dust contributions, right? So vehicle consumes the fuel, it gives the particulate matter per kilometer traveled, let's say this many milligrams of particulate matter, PM10 and 2.5. Now the greater contribution to the PM10 comes from this fugitive actually. So non-exhaust, the brake wear, exhaust, resuspension, if your road is having the loose silt, then obviously the movement of the vehicle on the roads will, especially in summer season, where the dryness will promote the resuspended dust and wind eroded dust. So that is one of the significant factor. But in winter, obviously the balance is shifted towards the combustion emitted particles. So this is another research finding in Canada. They compared across the rail, the freight transport, because I said the local air quality is affected by the traffic. If we talk about the regional for the entire state or country, then the majority of the kilometer travel moves towards the freight transport. Then in that case also we need to have a clear policy, right? So that to promote, say for example, the coal transport. If the mined coal in Jharkhand is going to be transported by the rail wagons or by water, sea transport, right? Then in that case, the carbon emission as well as the emissions, the pollutant, air pollutant emissions is going to be very, very less. So that has been clearly, emission inventory studies clearly showed. Now this is one of the quick example that compares the emissions of a bicyclist versus motorist. I'm not getting into too much detail. This we usually do to our students at UG and PG level. So I mean, even if you use a bicycle, we cannot say through the life cycle assessment there are no emissions. Why? Because we had to consume the foods in order to drive the bicycles or even to walk, right? So then the metabolism, the efficiency of the food to the energy in our human body is, let's say, only about 20%. Then if you take, say example, 5 kilometer distance covered by a bicyclist or by a two-wheeler or by a car, then in that case, you know at what speed a vehicle goes, and then what is the fuel consumption to cover that distance, then you know the emission factor associated with it. Then if you do the math, then you will come to know the gram of carbon dioxide emitted. Here they did the calculations for 5 miles distance, 5-mile rides. So a bike cyclist, because now you can wonder from where 964 grams of carbon dioxide is being comes. Why? Because the food intake in kilocalories, then to produce that food and to transport that food to the consumer, and then to prepare a food in a desired manner through a cooking. So put together all, this is the emission factor, right, per kilocalories, right? So 4.4 grams CO2 per kilocalories. Now again, you can talk about the mitigation measures and the policy, right? So if you
want to work,
I mean, if you want a, I mean, these days, right? I mean, even I am living in Jharkhand, you can have a vegetables that are grown in Tamil Nadu. People outside of India will also consume the vegetables and food and fruits grown in India, mangoes, or you take example of any items, rice and other things. But it does not come without environmental impacts, right? The distance travel, right, that materials to reach every part of the state, right? Obviously, that also contributes. That also contributes for carbon emissions and the air pollutant emissions. So if you are consuming what is available at your locality, right, then obviously the energy consumption and then pollutant emitted is going to be very, very less. We do not realize that it could be part of our policy, but this kind of example problem clearly shows that no, you'll have to come. But of course, the basis for all the calculation is about emission inventory plus life cycle assessment. When you do this kind of analysis, then it would be giving us the clear. So in this famous example problem, we show that, if you compare bicycle versus motor, the motor emits 1.5 kilograms in comparison to 960 grams. But however, if the motor vehicle is shared by the two persons, then we show that, the bicyclist actually emits more, the per person emission. I mean, these are the common points which anyway I explained over there. Now coming to the research point of view, so emission models. So I will skip all the introductory lectures over there. I will straight away get into the emission models. This is the stoichiometric. I mean, we show how the fuel combustion shows. You might be knowing about, the vehicle emission testing done periodically. So you will be seeing the parameters called, what are the pollutant features over there? Incomplete combustion product, carbon monoxide and hydrocarbon. Complete combustion products, let's say for example, particulate matter, and then NOx. If it is a diesel vehicle, then the smoke density test, right? These 5 are the parameters. Now, mathematically, we show to the students, the how emissions are quantified, because there are different type of engines, right? Spark ignition engines or CI engine, say for example, they use a different fuels. Then in that case, so what stimulates theoretically? Air fuel ratio, equivalence ratio, right? Then the stoichiometric ratio. So there are certain parameters that clearly shows so how the pollutant will be emitted if you have the measured parameters with each of them. Even in PUC systems, I mean, where the vehicle emission testing is periodically done, in my personal knowledge, what the parameters we see is only about the carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons. We are yet to see the particulate matter and NOx emission reporting. I have not seen in Dhanbad. I do not know about Patna and other cities, the emission, the certificate program because they come up with the validity of 6 months, right? So I have not seen in other cities whether the emission measurement done at the fueling stations includes the particulate matter and NOx or not. Why? Because it's easy to measure carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons. Whereas if you want to measure particulate matters, so you need to use altogether a different high cost instrument. So I'm not getting into that, the more mathematical and theoretical part. So this is one of the diagrams. If you see in each of the vehicles odometer, you will be having a green color zone, right? It is mentioned in two-wheelers and cars and most of the vehicles, green colored. So that green color shows the optimum in terms of, the emissions, right? So what we say is that the driving modes, if you drive at a very constant speed, right, without up and down, that means acceleration and deceleration, right? So that's called the cruising mode. If you are able to drive if you spend most of your trip in cruising mode, then obviously the environmental emissions will be very less. Now, what is shown in this graph, right? If you try to work it out, incomplete combustion product, it will result in increase in NOx. That is what's shown, right? If you have a lean mixture or if you have a rich mixture, right, with respect to the fuel, so it takes care of one type of pollutant form, but it results in increase in other type. So obviously catalytic converter would come into picture to decrease these kind of other pollutants. So in one case you will have to oxidize incomplete combustion product. For complete combustion products, you will have to reduce. So now this is about a case study. Where signalized intersections and roundabout, because signalized intersections are not there in tier 2 type cities, right? It is mostly what we encounter is the roundabouts. So now with respect to the emission models, right? For the line sources, we call it as the transportation sector, we call it as the line sources. So now one has to apply the traffic flow modeling parameters, right? Then you will have to come up with the vehicle density. Then you will have to come up with the congestion parameters. When you quantify the congestion, then accordingly the emission from the emission models will be adjusted. So we have, so this is all about, this is called homogeneous traffic. where you can clearly see the types of traffic for traffic flow modeling, where lane discipline is followed and only the particular type of vehicle is using. For cars, separate lane; for the heavy duty vehicles, separate lanes, right? This is called homogeneous lane discipline. Like we know that in India it's very difficult, right? But however, in some of the places, separate lane is introduced for the buses, so that the congestion to the two-wheelers and cars would be very less. So that is also introduced for the purpose of reducing the emission. So if everybody occupies the given space, if there are no lane discipline, then we call it as a heterogeneous traffic. So in heterogeneous traffic, it is very difficult to avoid congestion associated increased emission. So I mean, this is the pure theory. I'm skipping the theoretical part. This is about quadratic relationship. When the vehicle number increases, so the density peaks, then comes the DJ, jam density, we call corresponding figure, and then once it reaches the DJ, thereafter no more further vehicle can come out occupy your space, therefore it declines flow rate. I'm skipping the mathematical parts. So now let us talk about the types of model. So what I said, the fuel consumption data you have, the number of vehicles, then number of vehicles in each of the vehicle type category, then the kilometer traveled in passengers, then the freight. If you come up with all this data, then what you do is for the entire country level or state level, regional level inventory is prepared. So that is called the macroscopic. Then comes the models at the bottom, microscopic level models. That means individual vehicle emission. You put GPS to your individual vehicles or car following method, and then fit the on-road measurements, right? Real world emission measurements into the tailpipe, insert the sensors and the measuring probe, and then comfortably sit and perform trips as how you would perform your trip, very normal condition. So you collect the traffic data, percentage time spent in idle during your entire trip, percentage time spent in acceleration deceleration mode, then percentage time spent in cruising. You come up with all the analysis and data from individual vehicle class and for the individual road network. When you do that kind of study and collect the data, then it is called microscopic emission model. Then these data would be fed to the microscopic emission model. We have several models. US EPA developed models, right? So ARIA also have the emission factors, right? So it starts with like Caline, very famous models, Caline in late 90s and 80s. Then like we have the corporate emission factor models. Then we see EMEP, then cost projects that talks about the emission projection. Then we have the models mobile. Then we have IVE. Then we have the CMM. Model emission models, comprehensive. Then we also have the MOVES, MOVES, right? So we have different models as on today, right? Each model with the increasing difficulty level, you will have to collect more and more input data. So with the increasing difficulty level of the models towards the microscopic emission model, the level of input data need to be collected would also increase. So the time taken to come up with the emission by the individual vehicles would also increase, because you are collecting a data with the individual vehicle. Then out of the total population, you are choosing 30 cars, 30 two-wheelers, 30 autos, 30 bus, right? Then 30 commercial vehicles and freight carrying vehicles, truckers. Then you get all the traffic related, vehicle informations. You get other vehicle age, the mileage, fuel consumption, PETA. Then you come up with the type of road, paved road or unpaved road. What are the silt contents, right? Kilometer share in paved roads and unpaved roads. You come up with all the figures. Then the model gets you the fuel consumption, then the emissions per individual pollutant type. That is how we do the emission projections. I think now its time is close to 4:05. So 1 hour timeline was given to me. There are many more slides. Due to the time constraint, I'm trying to stop it over here and would be happy to address your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pandian. The floor is open. If anybody has any question, please raise the question.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So we work a lot on freight. So, and freight is, it's a difficult sector to work with because it's very disaggregated. But also given the number of vehicles are lower, but the emissions per capita vehicle is much more. So, would you recommend some kind of measures and has there been studies to quantify and solely attack freight emissions in India, in any city?
You are talking to freight transport?
Yes, freight, trucks
Yeah,
and vehicles, yes.
yes. There are research reports. Once I was also approached by railways to if they come up, increase the freight transport by the coal transport by the creating a separate lane for coal transport, and that would avoid the road transport. Then in that case, they wanted a feasibility study for how much emission reduction is happening. Similarly, there is also highways. Highways projects are basically expanded every year. In highways project also, they are increasing the number of lanes simply to avoid and decrease the congestion and time spent in other driving modes. So they have also done, the World Bank funded projects also talks about, Mumbai to Delhi and Kolkata to Delhi. So those research reports also I have come across. They clearly shown, if you are having a national highway with a limited road width, and then now they double it, the road width, then how much emission benefit it brought because of the freight transport from, from Mumbai and Kolkata to all the way to the Delhi and back to their respective destinations. So the research reports are clearly available. They have quantified the emissions. They have also discussed per kilometer how much emission benefits it yielded with respect to the carbon emission as well as to the air pollutant. So it's all about coming up with the data collection, and emission factors would be anyway used over there. So I can give another research paper where I have interesting finding. They compared the drinking water. You can buy a water bottle and have a drinking water for your meeting right now on today, right? And then you can simply boil the water which comes from your tap. And then another option is you have a kit at your home which gives you the treated water. So now in each of the three options they compared, the purchased bottled water, mineral water, had a 10-fold higher emission and impact upon the environment than other two methods. The reason is that the plastic bottles used and the cap and other materials used in the drinking water in 1 liter bottle, they predominantly come from Tamil Nadu. 50% of the manufacturing unit is in Tamil Nadu. Now you talk about Diwali emissions. Sivagasi is the sole producer of firecrackers. Now imagine the shipment from Sivagasi to that of all part of India or even outside of the India. Now we don't pay attention to that we are talking about only emission by busting the crackers. Now what about the emissions from all the way from the producing unit to that of the individual consumers? That is the major part of your emission also. Now when that increases the congestion, obviously. Now Durga Puja will come into picture. Now in the peak days where Mela will be conducted, obviously there will be a roadblocks. So every public will gather over there. Now if you want to catch an auto, you'll have to walk a longer distance. Now there will be a barricades imposed. The same is true in all the cases. These are all called, additional emissions, because everything has to be fine-tuned because of what can be only achieved by the managements, by urban people who hold the authorities urban level, and proper management plan, we can come up with the emission reductions.
Dear sir.
Yes, sir.
Current lecture. The thing is that vehicle is the mobility, and the mobility is growth, and the growth is again our development. Development leads to prosperity. But in terms of vehicle, if we consider, it has a negative impact on the health. What is your conclusion? Why, when the health is the priority, environmental health, human health, all this is the priority, government is introducing, investing lot of technology, right from technology, then cleaning the fuel, then some other leaded to unleaded fuel, then benzene to zero benzene, then blended fuel, desulfurization, so much of investment. And the vehicular pollution is increasing day by day. And the different policies are coming up. And if you see that Sustainable Development Goal report published last week, that also says the public transport is accessible to 30% of the people. Now, in that circumstances, keeping the investment in mind, keeping the health impact in mind, what you are suggesting for Indian cities?
Yes, sir. Yes. So I have a very strong opinion about, I see it as a two contributing factor. Like one way, our economy depends on sale of vehicles. So if you, like in plastic case, if you do not produce it, there will be no consumer. The problem is solved there itself, right? But we cannot do like that. The same is true with automobiles. If you decrease and put a constraint on who can own a vehicle, so that's true with developed nations in Singapore and all. If somebody is want to buy a new car, then he is going to pay double the amount, including that of the disposal of the vehicle for its lifetime. Then the congestion pricing. If you want to use the road during peak hours, let's say from office hours, morning 7 to 10, then he has to pay additional fee to use the roads where the congestion would be high. There are many schemes are there. That is altogether one part of the solution. The second part I am talking about, we need to promote a research and fund a program where how to achieve a reduction in VKT, vehicle kilometer travel. That is the best way to decrease the air quality levels. I mean, to have a better air quality levels at the local levels. Now, what is happening is that I will be buying a land in suburban. Why? Because it's cheaper than buying a land at center of the city. Now nobody is limiting me in buying a land in suburbans. Now, because I'm going to construct my house far away from the need points to my office or school or hospital for commercial activities, going to the shoppings. Now the distance increases. That contributes for vehicle kilometer travel. It's not just by buying the vehicles. I'm living in a IDSM campus. I'm never taking my vehicle out, right? I don't drive at all far away for shopping or others. I use a auto, hired, not even hired auto, shared with others, 5 to 10 rupees. Now, but it's not true. Not everybody is having the same flexibility. Now, public living, I mean, the rent of the house decreases in suburbans. Similarly, if you want to own a house, then also you are going outside of the city premises. Now, after 5 years and 10 years, now that area, now the shared auto will start from that area, which was not the part of the city. Now, after 5-10 years, the length and the transport system would keep on increase in vehicle kilometer travel. Now, what happens for my entire schooling or for graduations and all, I never used a motorized transport, 1 to 12 class, right? Now, for play class admission of my daughter, you are depending on dropping her by yourself or somebody, a van person, has to drop your kid. Now imagine they would be doing it for at least 15 years, play school, then LKG, UKG, then 12 years. Now imagine the time they spend up and down, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. School is at 8:30. I mean, van would come to your home by 7:30 because he has to take care of all the van would reach by 8 o'clock over there. If you want to drop it by yourself, but many kids come by their fathers with their fathers in car. Now the road is entirely blocked. If everybody goes in a shared van, then it's fine, it's manageable. The main gate of the school cannot give parking facility to 8,000 students. It's never impossible. You cannot have a land facilities in the center of the city to support the parking facility. Now we are not brave enough to tell them you cannot drop your kid by your car or even by the two-wheeler. Now who will impose the rule? Now who will choose? Now similarly, another policy. If you are living within the 2 kilometer radius from the school, I did a survey. Now you should give admission to those kids who will not be depending upon the school bus and the motorized transport. Once they cross the class of 4th and 5th, they can easily come by walk. Now it's again comes down to the government to have an infrastructure to ensure they will not make an accident if I send my kid by walk. So who will give assurance over there? So in abroad, they go by, the leg driven scoot. In Singapore, Malaysia, they move from one place to one place. Kids love that. But then we do not have infrastructure, and you cannot send, female kids by alone, or you will have to ensure, promote the infrastructure. Then we will have to come up with many policies at each individual level. Then it is really achievable in a long run. But then the research itself, if you focus only about, technology, that's not going to be benefit. By the time you come up with the technology, why? Because if you look at BS1 to BS6, we have achieved manifold emission reduction. We are able to come up with the car engine technology to meet zero emission. But the problem is that number of vehicle multiplied, that we don't realize the benefit of stringent emission standards. So then again, there is no net benefit. No matter, even if it is zero emission, they consume fuel, they give emission. You cannot deny that factor. So one way, increase the sale of vehicle and number and sharing the same. The other way, we talk about cutting it down from the technology and number. I don't agree with that point. Okay, that's for somebody else. But I am talking about how individually I can contribute, how I can live a lifestyle such that others would also follow me, starting from school kid. So if that will come into reality, then when they reach, the head of the family at the age of 25, 30, now they will take a better decision and follow the future generations would follow better, sustainables, or you call it, I tell the people, don't live in cities. You live in rural area and promote a rural living, then bring in the facilities over there. In rural, what is the benefit? Nobody buy a milk in packets in rural area. Never. Directly covered milk is distributed in house. The distance is very short. The vegetables, everything is short. That's the best way, if you talk about overall emission reduction. Nobody wants to live in rural area. They want a job, even if it is a painful one. In cities, they would prefer a school over there. They would prefer a job over there. You do everything, but there is a perception. Okay, this is what the standard of living. And unless you change their perception, and nobody wants to go back to the, back to their village. Nobody wants to move out. People forcibly did it maybe during COVID period, but not by choice, not by their choice. They are compelled to do it. They did it, but definitely it brought a lot of health benefit to them. But they are not in position to understand that health benefit is because of the fresh air they breathe, or because of the temperature differences, because of the flora fauna in the surrounding area. You have building everywhere, you have debris everywhere, you have vehicles everywhere. So it has the demerits, but nobody realized that it affects me. If it has to go from school level, at children level, you will have to introduce the policies and tell the children to tell their parents, okay, now in my school teacher, if school teacher says, kids are ready to follow. Rather than, but if somebody buys some new item, then the family members influence other person also to buy that item. So one way it is negative, but if you can bring the change among the kids, definitely after 20, 30 years, I believe that strongly. One day we will see a world that what we believe.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Upload.
No. Okay.
They are my own students. I shared in good time. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Pandit, for very informative discussions. Just 2 points that came in my mind after your lecture, that there are 2 solutions to reduce emissions or control air pollution. One is the technological part, and other is the sociological part, behavior part. And I think just by changing our behavior, we can cut down more emission as compared to technology. You gave the example of BS1 to 6, that despite conversion of BS1 to BS6, we have not achieved much. And you know the reason, because we have not changed our behavior. So one point is very clear, that along with technology, we have to see about our behavior. And another was very interesting point that you put about first you suggested that we should go for active transport. And then you gave the calculations. And that calculation was, kept us, all of us confused that whether we should go for active transport or not. So that was it came to my mind. I think that the solution is there that if you are going for, we have to go for active transport. I've always fought for it. But the rider that you put, it suggests that purchase your food from local market, not from high class stores, and try your best to utilize locally grown vegetables and fruits and everything rather than other things. If you have any other solution, please tell me. And clearly advise us that whether we should go for active transport or not.
Sir, active transport emission comes from because of the handling processes. Actually, that is a renewable one.
Yeah, but
If the emission comes from renewable, it gets replenished. We have enough carrying capacity.
give us a clear directive.
Yes.
Give us a clear directive. That what should we do? We should go for active transport or not?
Yes, sir. Without a doubt, active transport.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Even if we don't ride a cycle, still we are eating more food than what it is required.
That's true.
So somebody not driving cycle, it doesn't mean that they are not eating any food. But in reality, those who are doing a hard work on the field, they are the one eating less nutritious and less carbon emitting food. But whereas the people high economic class do not do any physical work, but they are the one who consume more nutritious and high carbon emitting food. So I mean, you can go on and talk, but it's the idea.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your
Thank you.
and thanks to all the participants also for attending this session. Yeah, we have another fourth lecture to be delivered per month. This is all of you know that this monthly event, and the fourth resource lecture will be titled "Air Pollution and its Health Impact in India: Perspective and Way Forward." And this lecture will be delivered by Dr. Sangnik Day of IIT Delhi on October 20th, 2022 at 3 p.m. We will create the links also and circulate among all of you. So block your time in your diary.
Sir,
It is,
I think we have to rethink about the date because 20th will be election in
okay.
20th October.
Yeah.
27th is holiday.
So we'll work on.
Okay, we will review the date.
20th.
It will be
Sir, we can make it on 21st.
we can
Last Thursday, na? Working Thursday.
ठीक है मतलब जब
we'll finalize the date. No.
Okay, we'll just.
And we have to take the consent from the speaker also.
right.
So the topic is there, that is announced. The speaker is confirmed. Date we will confirm later on after consulting the speaker because we have to think about his time also. It will be around 20th,
Right.
plus minus 2-3 days.
Right, sir.
So whatever date will be there within 1 week, we will put on our website also and send in the different groups. And we'll share the information to all of you. I'll request everybody to participate. Thanks to all of you once again for your presence.
Thank you for.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, it is open. Anybody can. YouTube.
Okay, sir. Bye, sir.
Everyone, they are arranging one lecture by eminent persons working in this area.
So continuing
all.
education program.
Yeah,
this is
we also get educated.
Exactly.
We get new things like this active transport and the food.
Dr. Sagnita is very good in air pollution health.
Yeah. No, Sanjay is working with us. We know him very well. And you are also